Welcome to Resistant AI's event series, where we will arm you with the knowledge you need to fight today's increasingly sophisticated financial criminals.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the fifth in our series of Bright Talk events. The series is entitled Fighting Financial Crime in an Automated World. Today's session is Buy Now, Pay Never, How to Fight Fraud in Real Time with Limited Data. My name is James Broadhurst, Principal Consultant with the Resistant AI. And in previous episodes, we've examined themes such as the explosion in cybercrime, how financial crime and cybercrime are converging. We've looked at some ideas to help make best use of artificial intelligence when fighting back against those threats. And today we're going to look at the phenomenon which is buy now, pay later. One of the most exciting and popular forms of personal finance right now. And specifically, we're going to examine how the aforementioned threat of cybercrime and fraud can challenge the success of buy now, pay later. Just as a reminder for the audience, if you want to submit some questions, you can please do that in the panel underneath at the bottom of your screen, if you're not in full screen mode. And without further ado, let's get on and introduce the panel. So today we're really pleased to be joined by our guest from outside of Resistant, Faraz Rana. Faraz is a renowned fintech leader. And Faraz was part of the team that helped launch and scale Bread, a buy now, pay later company based in the US, from inception to successful sale or exit in late 2020. Faraz was chief legal officer there, as well as wearing a number of different hats, which he'll tell us a little bit more about in a second. And then he moved on to found Blue Ridge 561, a fintech consulting practice that works with companies in various stages of growth. So Faraz, thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, James. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. Thank you very much. And we also have with us our own Joe Lemonnier, who's Director of Product Marketing here in Resistant AI. And Joe spent the better part of the last decade working in different roles related to online privacy and cybersecurity, specifically working in product, in design, sales and marketing. And those roles have helped impact hundreds of millions of users. And here in Resistant, he joined us last year. He's helping develop and roll out our product strategy. So welcome, Joe.
Thanks a lot.
Good to have you here. Faraz, I mean, maybe you wouldn't mind spending a few seconds, a couple of minutes, telling us a little bit about your background for those who are not familiar with your work.
Yeah, no, thank you, James. Pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the warm introduction. I don't think I'm renowned in any capacity, but I'll take the words nonetheless. Yeah, my immediate role at Bread was a chief legal officer, was really to be an advocate for risk and compliance. But I also had the unique vantage point of being there at the very beginning, helping to shape the product and the strategy of the company. And what that really gave me is a perspective of how companies, especially fintech companies, can manage risk and growth. And I think that for fintech companies to succeed, they really have to get both right. And so what I've been doing since the exit is helping other fintech companies do that. The name of my firm, Blue Ridge 561, if any of your audience members are from Virginia, is a reference to the Blue Ridge Mountains where I grew up. And so, that's what I'm doing right now.
And the 561 for us, I was just curious about that.
Yeah, very good question. It was my childhood home address. So 561 Blue Ridge Drive near the Blue Ridge Mountains is where I grew up.
Okay. A lot of personal details there in the
right. A lot of details. Luckily, I don't live there anymore. So if anybody wants to go visit the address.
Great. That's great. I was just curious about the number. Fantastic. I think some of the topics you already mentioned there are going to be really interesting, really useful for us today. And for Joe and myself, we're actually working right now in a scale up. It's good to have you here. I'm sure we're going to learn quite a lot. So we're here to talk about BNPL, buy now, pay later, in terms as a form of personal finance. Certainly very popular at the moment. There's a lot of lenders out there who've risen to prominence quickly, and Faraz, you've been involved in building one such organization. What we wanted to do today was look at some of the drivers behind that success, look at perhaps some of the risks of those kind of businesses. Are these lenders in some way perhaps caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of balancing growth with fighting financial crime? So maybe just as a lead into the other topics we're going to cover, Faraz, I know you have a lot of experience in this particular business. Maybe you could give us a little sort of potted history on where this type of finance came from, and perhaps even your views on current state of the market and where we are right now, where we might be heading.
Yeah, happy to share. BNPL, buy now, pay later, acronym that really came about, I think, a year ago when we started the company Bread in 2015. I wish we had that acronym because it would have been easier to answer the question, what does your startup exactly do from friends and family? BNPL 101, a lot of people ask me, what does it mean? Buy now, pay later. Fancy way of saying you are buying everyday things on credit. And one of the first questions we would get, and I think people still ask this question, is why do we need this product? I mean, credit has been around for a long time. Credit cards have been around for a long time. What is so unique about BNPL? And when we were launching Bread, there was really one key customer that we were trying to target, and one customer that was really asking for this product, and that was the homegrown e-commerce retailer. This is not the offline retailer who's building a website. This is not the Walmarts of the world who set up a website. These are the retailers who have built their entire ecosystem online. And we realized quickly that they speak a very different language. For them, conversion and customer sales happens in fractions of a second, not minutes. And so when they talked about financing to the traditional credit markets, and we would have these conversations with them, they would tell us, look, I've got 2.3 seconds to convert my customer. And I went to traditional credit financing provider A, and they told me, great, well, we can put a link on your website, and it's going to take the customer away from your website to our website, and they're going to download a PDF, and they're going to print it out, and they're going to fill it out and scan it and fax it. And then they'll have a credit card in 7 to 10 days, and then they can buy the thing on your website. So obviously that didn't work. And so what we built, we thought was a gap in the market, was a digitally native credit product. And what is core to that product is absolute lack of friction. It has to be simple, easy, very fast, easy to use. And so that was the core genesis of the product. It was, when we started, there were only 2 companies in the space, Bread and Affirm, which is out in the West Coast. And now the product has evolved into multiple different products, multiple different verticals, different variations of that financing product. But I think that core ethos remains the same, which is it has to be very, very frictionless. And I think what we're going to talk about today is very relevant to that topic, because when you're really aiming for lack of friction, how do you balance out KYC and risk and compliance? And that was one of my challenges at Bread, being the chief legal officer, when I had a product team that was really focused on growth and conversion. How do we balance out some of the other things that do add friction?
That's great. Thanks, Faraz. That's a really, I actually learned quite a lot there from about the origins of BNPL and the friction question. So having worked a little bit in fraud in the past, friction was always a challenge, but I think it's that challenge has been magnified, amplified, just because of the sheer pace of this vertical and that very limited time you have to actually make a decision on whether to to convert or make the right decision so that you convert that customer. Joe, so sort of pivoting over a little bit towards fraud, and I know you've investigated this area quite a lot recently. Do you think that the prevention of fraud for a buy now pay later player is at the front of their minds always? Do you think there are players who take it more seriously than others, and what are the factors in play here?
I think it's not exactly fair to say necessarily that some are taking it seriously and not. I think it's a problem that grows with the growth of the business, right? The more visibility the business has, naturally, the more it gets attention from fraudsters. They're suddenly on the map. People know they exist. The other thing is also, as you grow, you get more merchants on board to use the service, and therefore you have more exposure, right? So that creates sort of that mindset and that need to start dealing with fraud in a different way. And so the problem really grows with their growth. It ties together, it accelerates that way. One thing that really matters, though, in how they're able to deal with fraud, from what we've been able to see, is basically the quality and the quantity of the data that they are able to collect. If you are starting out launching a new service, You have kind of more work to do to collect that data. But if you look at a company like PayPal, which has launched its own version of these services, they already had years of data on their customers and how they behave in order to kind of see what is fraudulent behavior, what is strange, and sort of deal with the problem there.
Thanks, Joe. And just to dig a little bit deeper on one thing you mentioned there, data, very much a part of our business. Is it fair to say that it's more challenging because there are more components or elements or people in the chain here? So we have the consumer, we have the merchant, we also have the buy now pay later lender or actor. Does that just make it harder to actually get all of the data you might need to make a rapid but also accurate fraud decision?
It can be. I think it's especially a question of the quality of the data that's being collected. So it's really a matter of how you're able to corral and organize that with the merchants on one end, and then depending on the amount of friction you want to put in the actual process with your customer, the amount of KYC processes is very variable. We've seen some who have quite a few steps and do some checks on the customers that use the service, and others who really have almost nothing. So it's very variable.
Yeah, I think it tends to depend as well on how much you can, as the lender at the end of the chain there, how much you can convince the merchant to pass on. I think that's often a challenge as well. Faraz, just to come back to yourself, do you, and so asking you as somebody who's been through this, I read somewhere that I think it was perhaps in Forbes that traditionally companies or financial services companies would build their products starting by looking at the risk, whereas perhaps as you sort of explained earlier, you were kind of almost building a completely new type of service. What was at the forefront of your mind when you were setting up Bread, or helping to set up Bread? Was it, hey, I've got to maximize the value of this and build it as fast as possible? Were you doing that also at the same time thinking about risk? What were your sort of priorities, if you like, at that time?
Yeah, I mean, we took a holistic approach to building what we thought would be a sustainable company. So to give you a perspective, our first few hires were, apart from the founders and the CEO, a chief risk officer, a few engineers, and a chief legal officer. So that was a core founding team before we even hired a sales team. And we obviously had a CTO and a product team, but that was it. So we really balanced out the table, metaphorical and literal table, with the folks who are thinking about defense and risk, and folks who are thinking about offense and growth. I think that approach worked well for us. I think in our mind the goal was always to build a profitable company. But a lot of our peers don't take that approach, and you can argue that they've grown faster than we did. They take the approach of, well, let's just gain market share, and we can figure out the risk part later. My own perspective, I don't think that works, because I think once you sort of built a culture around growth at all costs, it's very hard to turn that off. It's very hard to get the risk person in the room, at the very end and say, hey, we brought this person in here and now they're going to ruin the party for everyone. No one's going to listen to that person. And so I really think you have to build that culture from the beginning. And so, part of that culture is, when you're building the product itself, building rules around fraud and credit loss, and thinking about that as much as you're thinking about conversion.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think it's very hard to bolt that on afterwards. So you have to build it in from the beginning, and perhaps not everyone goes about it the same way you did. But I think sustainable was your goal there, and I think you were successful in that way. Great. So moving on to talk a little bit about the risk to BNPL from fraud, and moving over to Joe. Maybe we can look at some of the different threats that are posed to such a financial services player by fraud, because we were talking through this the other day, weren't we? And we came up with quite a few, I suppose, risks or types of fraud that could be in play. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about that part, Joe?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge on a fraud perspective that any buy now pay later service really faces is actually sort of a gray area. It's kind of what you might call like the never intended to pay problem of one-off fraud. Is the person who committed the fraud like not paying their credit and it's just a credit loss, or did they actually intend to defraud you? So this is actually a very difficult problem to really assess and to know off the bat what you're dealing with. And we've seen a lot of our customers kind of like trying to answer that question. Something that becomes a bit more clear is when you start dealing with serial fraud, right? So because of the sort of limited KYC steps that are put in the frictionless aspect of some of these services, a lot of customers are able to, a lot of fraudsters, sorry, are able to just produce a series of identities and flood these systems and basically test out what passes and what doesn't, and to commit either a large volume of low value fraud, or on the contrary, to just kind of build up towards some sort of a bust out fraud situation. The other types of threat that often occur is account takeovers, right? So, you know, when somebody's been a loyal customer to one of the buy now, pay later services, they might have more trust with the service and access to higher credit limits. So taking over those accounts allows them to get away with more damage, with less of the work and less of the patience.
Yeah, I think that last one's interesting because it's possibly the quickest route to the fraudster making the most amount of money. They need to gain the credentials of the genuine user, I suppose, but it's certainly quicker than the kind of sleeper activity where you might start out buying some low value products and build up your credit and then do the bust out. Lots of different fraud scenarios here, and it's quite challenging for a business because you're dealing with perhaps, you know, at the sort of the top of the list you mentioned there, almost first person fraud, somebody who thinks, well, I can probably get away with defrauding, you know, a few $100s from this buyer. I'm not, you know, it's an unsecured loan. I think the part that's interesting for us specifically in Resistant is that serial fraud that you mentioned, looking for links between one person or a group of people actually coming up with multiple identities. So maybe we come back to that in a second. What do we think are powering these attacks? What makes it, seems to me, much easier now to defraud this kind of organization?
Well, the growth of these services overall has obviously attracted a lot more attention, and a lot of these criminals are organized, and so they're learning quite quickly about how these services work and testing them out. But the other thing that's really enabled them is basically just the glut, cheap supply of IDs that are available, either stolen or, you know, fabricated, just forgeries that are produced en masse with templates, or, you know, synthetic IDs that are pieced together. You know, this has become a very cheap commodity actually in the market at this point, and so it's really allowed them to kind of really flood into these services. The other thing that's really kind of helped them is you know, tools like automation, which has really allowed them to scale up their attacks and be able to manage all these IDs at once. So this is sort of a trend that we've started seeing, is more and more bots being used to kind of generate new accounts and to flood the systems.
So yeah, one other, Joe, if I could add,
sure.
One other tool at their disposal is a lack of hard inquiry. So hard inquiry is when you apply for credit and there's an inquiry on your credit report. BNPL pushed as an industry to get rid of that, because when you're dealing with, again, frictionless product and small dollar loans, it's very hard to have a hard inquiry every time you apply for a loan. And so, you know, we push pretty hard with the credit reporting agencies not to have that. It's not a legal requirement. So now you're dealing with a soft inquiry. That doesn't show up on your credit report. So it's easier for someone to steal someone else's identity before that victim finds out.
Sure. I think it's quite an interesting point, because we're seeing that those same credit reference agencies now are setting up specific bureau for buy now, pay later providers, where you kind of pass under the radar, but are put into a different pool, and your credit rating doesn't suffer just from the fact that you're, you know, getting a fairly low value finance operation approved. Do you think that that's a reflection in perhaps a process that kind of doesn't favor so much the rigor around credit risk? What are your thoughts on that for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a debate happening in the industry now, and a good debate about what the right balance is, because, you know, for credit reporting agencies obviously thrive on data, and part of that data comes from the hard inquiry. But I think I don't, on that specific question, I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I do think there's a healthy debate happening right now between the industry and the credit reporting agencies and the regulators about what's the right amount of data and friction that you need in the product to kind of stop the inflow of fraud.
Mm. Excellent, thanks. So maybe back to Joe, moving on to look at what might be the solutions to this fraud risk. Where do you think the solution lies, Joe? I mean, do we need more data? We've talked about maybe the complexity of the overall operation, that you have a merchant, you have a consumer, the lender. Where does the responsibility for fraud typically lie, or does it change? Is there a single sort of model for this?
Well, generally speaking, and I think this is something Faraz might agree with, but since the buy now, pay later services are taking on a lot of the loan risk, if you will, the merchants might, in some cases, want to wash their hands off of it. It's important to have a really good relationship with the merchants to get the right kind of data collected, and to organize those best practices with them. Some of the key data points that people should be collecting are, anything they have on the details of the customer, obviously, and the device intelligence, but also things like the basket infos, like what were they actually purchasing? What are their purchase behaviors? And key to it all is the delivery address, because at the end of the day, it is about getting products out of the system. So finding out what is the key delivery address is really important. But another aspect that's really key is sort of keeping a control on the quality of the data. So by that, I mean, try to limit the input choices for that data. If you're providing a field for a street address, make sure that it's not something that somebody can write, Saint, St, Henry Streets, versus actually spelling out Saint. You're dealing then with the same street, but it's a different string. You have all this reconciliation and difficulty you need to do. So if it's more of a drop-down situation where you're limiting the choices and funneling it and simplifying that funnel as much as possible, you're improving the quality of the data you have to work with tremendously. So these are kind of practical first steps that any service should be looking into.
Yeah. Sorry, go on, Faraz, go ahead.
I was going to say those are all great points. I mean, I think we evolved on all of those points over the years. In the beginning, it was sort of very nascent and raw, but I think over the years we've kind of evolved on each of those. And part of, I think, the right equation is having the merchant have some skin in the game. And so by that, I mean allocating some of the fraud risk to them if they don't do certain things, or setting kind of minimum parameters on what they need to do. But yeah, I think that eventually should be the end goal, is a partnering together, both the lender and the merchant, on fraud risk.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think if both parties are, as you might say, on the hook for at least some of the fraud risk, it's perhaps going to encourage, perhaps even more responsible behavior towards consumers. I think there's probably a little bit of a question there around should consumers be made more aware of some of the risks here. It's very fast-paced lending as well. How do we deal with that, Joe? Because really, we might have not a lot of data. We have very little time. What kind of techniques are needed there to
on a baseline layer? You want to first of all find ways of actually increasing the cost of committing fraud. So some of these things can be very simple. If you can send a simple SMS confirmation, for example, it's not about the cost of the SMS in this case. But if somebody's really trying to commit serial fraud on your service, they're going to need a lot of these cards, or they're maybe going to need multiple phones, because if you're collecting the device intelligence, you'll be able to compare some of this data. So just by creating that slight extra cost to committing fraud, as opposed to creating friction for a regular customer, you're already kind of putting yourself in a better position to deal with some of these problems. After that, of course, having historical data on the behavior of customers is what's going to be key to stopping things like account takeovers. If you know the patterns and behaviors that they've had, the kind of products they're interested in, any sudden shift in their data, in their delivery address, in their purchase behavior, these are all going to flag up. And at that point, you really need a system that is kind of looking at the data holistically, contextually, and trying to pick up anomalies in real time. It's not something that you can do with just a single model. You really need to build a successive layered approach to dealing with this problem.
Thanks, Joe. Actually, you said one word there I was going to ask you about. So anomaly detection. using behavioral data, so understanding what's been going on in the past, is a key to being able to detect that kind of anomalous behavior in the future, which might point towards the point when a fraudster is going to do the bust down act. Is that key to what we're doing in resistance? The looking for what is not normal.
That is a core to it, yes. One of the aspects is we do look at anything that stands out substantially, but the other thing that's key to how we approach the problem is actually with very subtle ID clustering. We're not doing link analysis that's just comparing very obvious data points like, oh, this is the exact same phone number, this is the exact same email, but we go much more nuanced approach to these kind of problems, where we start looking at attempts to create randomness in the email, right? Attempts to create random birth dates for different identities that are being loaded. Each one of these individually is very weak data point and doesn't necessarily indicate anything. But once you start combining a lot of these different touch points together, you start having basically improbable statistical events, and they really stand out like a sore thumb. And at that moment, you can hone into those problems and start dealing with them pretty effectively. Good,
Joe. So having multiple analytical capabilities is a key, right? To on one hand, having the sophistication to detect which is what might be an anomalous event, but on the other hand, we need to make sure we keep friction low, we reduce false positives, because we haven't got a whole lot of time to be sifting through with manual reviews these events. We have to make real-time decisions.
Yes, so our system is kind of built in two components. On one end, we're preventing fraud attempts in real time. So we're the last call in the chain of decision making, if you will. But then every day or every 15 minutes or however we want to set up the system, we have sort of a learning phase that kind of looks at what was the end result of these calls, what was a real threat and what wasn't. And then that goes back to feeding the original prevention engine, basically. So it's a cycle that happens, learning every cycle.
Excellent, great. And to give Faraz a chance to chip in here. Faraz, I mean, from when you started Bread or when you helped start Bread to where we are now, do you think that the world has moved on significantly in terms of the fraud threat, but also the way we can respond to those threats? How do you see it?
Yeah, both, I think. So certainly the fraud threat has gotten significantly higher, I think partly because of the mainstream attention to BNPL. And that as a product in the market. And so I think that has gotten a lot more attention. Even as we were building Bread, I think we were seeing that rise happen slowly and gradually. And that, we exited in 2020, and I think there's been a lot of attention in the market since then as well. But when we began, our fraud rules were all homegrown, and they were coded in, hardwired into the system. We didn't have products out there that we could use, or at least not good products. And part of, I think, effective fraud prevention is being very agile. And having modular rules that you can turn off and turn on as sort of you're balancing that, that tricky balance between risk and growth, and, turning down people and false positives and reacting to a fraud ring. And so that's very hard to do when you're sort of hardwired in your software code and you need to bring in 10 engineers and kind of change the code. So, tools that you can tack on, off-the-shelf tools where you can, turn down levers and turn up are really important. We didn't have too many of them, and I think they're, the fact that they exist now will only help the industry. I mean, they'll prevent fraud, but I think they'll help the growth of the industry as well.
That's a good last point, because I think those are the dual objectives, aren't they? To facilitate that growth, which at the end of the day, these startup organizations are looking for, but in a way which is, as you said earlier, sustainable. Great, Joe. Any last thoughts from you as we wrap up?
No, I think Faraz did a really good job of concluding all the points.
Excellent. Well, massive thanks to the panel. Thanks to Faraz. I certainly learned a lot today about the history of buy now, pay later, and we're looking ahead a little bit as well. Thanks to Joe as always. Just a reminder again, if you have any questions, please put them into the panel at the bottom of the screen, and we will see you very soon on our next session. Thanks very much for participating. We'll speak soon.
Thank you for attending. Please visit our Bright Talk channel, where you'll find details about our other events. Please be sure to rate this session.